Welcome to the stage, IGP Faculty Policy Director, Secretary Jacob Liu.
Good afternoon and welcome everyone. I'm Jack Liu, the Faculty Policy Director here at IGP, as well as a Professor of International and Public Affairs at SIPA. In public life, I served at the White House as Director of the Office of Management and Budget, Chief of Staff to the President, and later as Secretary of the Treasury. And it was my honor to work with mayors of both parties from across the country, including my friend and now colleague, Mike Nutter. Today, I'm delighted to introduce IGP's latest across-the-aisle conversation on the future of U.S. cities, which is also the 2026 M. Moran Weston II Distinguished Lecture in Urban and Public Policy. When we kicked off the Across the Aisle series a few years ago, the world looked very different than it does today. In late 2023, not that many years ago, the Middle East was bracing from the October 7th attacks on Israel by Hamas. Eric Adams was mayor of this great city, and the price of crude oil was around $80 a barrel. Today, we are at war in the Middle East. New York City's mayor has described himself as a socialist, and oil prices are hovering over $100 a barrel. We've also seen our cities become battlegrounds in the violent crackdowns against immigrants by our Department of Homeland Security. To make sense of this current situation and assess the future of cities in an increasingly polarized and uncertain political climate, we are especially grateful to have two distinguished leaders with us today, Mayors Eric Johnson and Michael Nutter, for what I know will be a thoughtful discussion. At a time of polarization, our IGP Across the Aisle series is committed to the value of respectful discourse. And cities are places where practical governance often rises above ideological divides. Mayors, perhaps more than anyone else in public life, are judged by their results, whether streets are safe, budgets are balanced, businesses are growing, and families can afford to live and work in their communities. Another reality shaping the work of city leaders today is fiscal constraints, as mayors navigate difficult budgetary trade-offs at a time when federal and state support is strained. Cities must deliver essential services, public safety, infrastructure, housing, and social services, often while facing limited resources and rising costs. As someone who has spent decades working on fiscal policy, I know these choices are difficult but unavoidable. This challenge is particularly great when economic pressures and affordability concerns are front in mind for so many Americans. At the same time, federal policies on issues like immigration and public safety often play out most visibly at the local level, with mayors on the front line, grappling with human, legal, political dimensions ranging from concerns about public safety to the anxieties of families about detention and deportation. Mayors have the task of managing policy consequences and also sustaining civic cohesion at difficult moments. And that's why today's conversation is so important. So thank you for being here. Let me now introduce our esteemed panelists. Eric Johnson is the 60th mayor of Dallas, first elected in June 2019. He was reelected in May 2023 with the striking margin of 99% of the vote.
That's true. 98.7. They rounded that up.
Was anybody else running?
There was. There actually was.
Earlier, Johnson was a member of the Texas House of Representatives, where he served on several legislative committees, including Appropriations, Ways and Means, Higher Education, and Natural Resources. He also chaired the Dallas area legislative delegation. In addition to being mayor of the country's 9th largest city, Mayor Johnson also served as counsel for the international law firm of Troutman, Pepper, and Locke LLP. He will be joined in conversation by our very own Mayor Michael Nutter, who is SIPA's David M. Dinkins Professor of Professional Practice in Urban and Public Affairs. He was elected the 98th mayor of Philadelphia in 2007 and took office in 2008 at the height of the financial crisis. As mayor, he delivered on a commitment to strong financial and fiscal stewardship and managed the city through its worst economic recession since the Great Depression. Please join me again in welcoming Mayor Johnson and Mayor Nutter.
Jack, thank you for that introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. We are very excited, the mayor and I, to be here. We were together last night and had a chance to catch up. We've known each other for a while. Mayor, I've got a bunch of questions for you, but I always like to, Jack did a fantastic job with the intro, but beyond what we might read on the official bio and the Wikipedia page and et cetera, Dallas, ninth largest city by population in the country, significant rivalry, Cowboys and Eagles. We expect to take you this year again, but we'll go to a game. Tell us a little bit more about both yourself and Dallas.
Well, I'll try to be as brief as I can about myself. I could talk about my city forever, but before I do any of that, I just want to say it's so great to be on Columbia's campus. It's been a long time, but it's great to be in New York always, and I love this campus. I actually spent a summer working for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund back when I was in graduate school and lived just a little bit past Cathedral Parkway, not far from here. So for that summer, so it brings back a lot of fond memories to be back on this campus.
Good.
But about me, really briefly, I ran for mayor in 2019 after having served in the legislature for almost a decade. Had no intention of really running for mayor, hadn't planned on that. It was not like at all a lifelong ambition of mine to be mayor. I hadn't really thought about city government before, to be perfectly frank. My exposure to government really had been as I went to Princeton School of Public and International Affairs, and
We've heard of them.
yeah, yeah. So I went there and I worked in the state legislature after I did that, and so I kind of had a background in state and local government, and when an opportunity came to run for the state legislature, that really spoke to me. I really cared a lot about education issues and things that you deal with at the state level. So I ran for the state house, and actually that's a long but interesting story that I won't share today, because I ran against an incumbent who ended up going to prison for corruption and a bunch of stuff. But anyway, I was not expected to win that race. It was considered a long shot race, and I ended up winning it, and I ended up winning it by kind of a big margin, and stayed in the state house for about a decade. I was doing fine in the state house, was not experiencing the legislative wins that I wanted to experience. At the time, I was a Democrat. I've switched parties since then, and the House and Senate were controlled by Republicans at the time. So
we'll talk about that.
Yeah, I had good relationships, though. Even then, I had very good relationships with the Republicans, so I got more done than maybe the average Democrat, but I still wasn't getting a ton done, because stuff gets done on a partisan basis in a legislature like that. So I was getting a little bit restless. The mayor's race was coming up in Dallas. Hadn't really given that any thought. But when I looked at the field of candidates who were running, I didn't see anyone running who, I thought really. I'm got to be careful, because I work with these folks, and I know some of them. I didn't see anybody who I just thought would make a great mayor of Dallas. I was born and raised in Dallas. I'm a Dallas kid, and I just didn't see the person, like the clear person in that field of 8 people at the time. Wow. that would do a great job leading our city, and also I didn't see anybody that would make me say, oh well, I can possibly.
So you wanted to step
person.
up into.
So I wanted to step up, and I wanted to lead in a different context. I had served in the state house for I think a long enough time to be ready for a different challenge. Yeah. So I threw my name in the hat. At the very last minute. I was the 9th candidate of 9, and I ended up winning the race. So yeah, I've had a couple of improbable wins, but that's how I got started.
So you've been in for a little bit. I know you obviously enjoy coming to New York, but and all that New York has to offer, but from a business standpoint, talk to us about Y'all Street?
Yeah, I don't know if any of y'all have heard about this. That's what we're calling the very rapidly growing financial services sector in Dallas that is frankly taking a lot of financial services personnel out of New York and moving it to Dallas, and it's really kind of cool. I think this started a few years back when New York State was floating a tax on securities transactions. That made some people nervous in the financial services industry. So they started looking at, if this were to come to pass, where could we operate that might be, more business friendly? And I think that started some conversations with our governor that led to some talks with the stock exchanges. The NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange started talking about possibly, what would happen, if that tax were to pass.
Yeah.
Would they want to move their operations to Texas? And that really kind of got a bunch of conversations started that even though that tax did not pass, people started to look at where they thought the future of the financial services industry in the country was headed. And people started to realize that we meant business down there in Texas and Dallas specifically. And so you had some financial services companies actually make some pretty significant investments in Dallas. So I think the biggest one to date has been Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs is not hidden the fact that they believe that the Sun Belt and the part of the country from Florida to Texas is where the growth in the country is headed, and so they've committed to an office in Dallas, right in our downtown, this area we're calling Y'all Street, that is going to be the second largest office in their entire company, but will have every function of the bank in Dallas, which is not even true in New York. So it'll be the only office in the firm that has that, and they're going to invest. The last number we've heard, they're over $700 million in investment in that one office.
So,
and about 5,000 employees is what we're expecting them to hire.
So we're at a public policy school. Someone proposes a particular policy. And it clearly has had a ripple effect. Even though it didn't go forward, the one thing business does not like is uncertainty.
That's right.
And so people started exploring options.
Yeah.
And looked to Texas and Dallas in particular, just because of a potential policy change.
That's true. That's absolutely true. And look, I will give you a more recent example of that. And look, I think it's a great point. And I think the way I would say this plays out is, I think that rhetoric matters because people understand that rhetoric can and often does translate into policy if that rhetoric, is being touted on the campaign trail. And you're successful in winning office. There's a chance you may act on that rhetoric. And so I think that the reason why the conversations I'm having right now are intensifying in part is also because of the most recent election here in New York. The conversation around wealth taxes, the conversation around increasing property taxes, the conversations around...
Well, the big conversation is also about affordability.
Yes. And
affordability crisis.
And I hope we get a chance to talk about what that even means because I have some thoughts on that. But the point is at some point, people become concerned that if you achieve political power, your rhetoric will become policy. And so I think these companies are comparing regulatory schemes. They're comparing the business climate in terms of property taxes, in terms of who's willing to embrace these companies and make deals. And we have been very aggressive in Dallas about incentivizing companies who want to create jobs, and we, will make deals where if they agree to create a certain number of jobs and hire a certain number of Dallas residents, we will abate property taxes and things like that. So
let me ask you this
been pretty successful.
And then we're going to jump into a particularly timely topic. Obviously, you're a business-friendly mayor.
Very.
And I think we've known each other, so you were business friendly when you were a Democrat.
Yes.
And you continue that even though the switch of party, which we'll get to in a second. But how do you balance issues and concerns of constituents, affordability crisis, while also being generally business favorable? There are some who would see a conflict there. How do you balance that?
I don't know that I see the conflict between being business friendly and caring about affordability. I think that here's where I think Dallas is a little different, and I'm a little different from what you hear and see here in New York, for example. And I'd say it's also being discussed in California too. Mm-hmm. Our biggest source of relocations, corporate relocations, and people is California primarily. New York loses more of its people to Miami. That's an established sort of pattern there, and we have more of a pattern with Southern California in particular, but really the Bay Area too.
Right.
I think what's really at play is whether or not you believe you can actually drive down costs for people through direct intervention in the economy. What essentially, I think the mayor of New York and the folks who call themselves socialists really believe. They believe that the way you make rent, lower is to impose rent controls. Mm-hmm. And the way you make housing prices lower, and the way you make prices of groceries lower, and the way you make the price of childcare lower is to directly intervene in those markets using the power of government.
You disagree?
I do, and I think that is, and this is something we ought to be able to have a real discussion about. I don't think that everything that we were taught in our introductory economics courses and everything you've been studying here at SIPA and everything else is null and void, or somehow been replaced. I still think the primary driver of the cost of something is the supply of it and the demand of it and where they intersect. Mm-hmm. And if you're not able to somehow change that, then you're not going to, in the long run, be able to lower or raise the price of anything. It's just markets really do drive these things. And so,
what's the government's role or responsibility in that?
So, for example, when it comes to housing, mm-hmm. I think that what we have to do, and I've testified before Congress about it, I've been pushing it at the local level at home, is we have to increase the supply of housing if we want to lower the price of housing.
Who's building that housing?
So the private sector has proven time and time again that they are the most efficient builder of housing if you will actually help them by allowing them and permitting them to build. Mm-hmm. And if you will actually sort of not throw so many hurdles and red tape in the way of them doing what they are incentivized to do by capitalism, frankly. Where we get into trouble, I think, is when we as the government think that we can actually, through fiat, do a better job of setting the price of things than the market can. It doesn't work. It's not sustainable. And so what we are, I think, more about in Dallas mm-hmm. is trying to lower the price of housing to the extent that we think we have an affordability problem. Right. Our housing costs are still a fifth of the price of New York, half of the price of California. So, we're getting a lot of people coming to our city because right. we're relatively affordable. Yeah. But affordable is, I think, a product of success and how successful you're being. We're being very successful in attracting people and companies to our city, which is driving up the price of things.
Right. But if you have a lot of money, pretty much everything is affordable, right?
That's the other side of affordability that doesn't get a whole lot of discussion, which is why I've actually been pretty adamant about us leaning into workforce development and trying to help people avail themselves of job opportunities that exist in our city, because the other part of affordability is how much people are making. And we really do have an underemployed population in this country and in my city too, where folks could be earning more money if they were retooled and they improved their skills. But again, my main point here is I'm not personally a believer that it is a sustainable solution to think that the solution to the cost of things is electing a mayor who's going to get in there and be able to, fix the price of things. We've got to try to intervene through the market forces of supply and demand.
Dallas is a blue city and a red state down south.
It is. It is.
Where are the folks in Dallas? Where are your constituents? We don't hear a whole lot about ICE, for instance. ICE activity, ICE policies. Some promote abolishing ICE, changing ICE, fixing ICE. We don't hear or see much on the national scene out of Dallas about that. Why do you think that is?
Well, that's an interesting question about, I think you're correct. I think Dallas is definitely it leans Democrat for sure. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's a hard, left, but it's
well, there are many shades
it's
of
kind of a center left city.
Yeah.
And it's in a part of the country that I think it's interesting to be at Columbia having this conversation, because I do feel like I remember.
That's why you're here.
Well, I remember living on the East Coast and feeling like, being from Texas, even though I was at the time a Democrat and identified that way, I still felt a little bit out of step with most of the folks that I met who were from this part of the country, because I do think that the center of the country, Texas at least, that's what I know, I was born and raised, Dallas, I think we're just a little more pro law enforcement, a little more conservative by nature, a little more trusting of institutions by nature. And so I feel like even though Dallas leans left, mm-hmm. I don't feel like ICE is being viewed, I think, primarily as a law enforcement agency. And we have a respect for law enforcement in Dallas that I think,
or an out of control agency.
I don't think that the perception in Dallas. I think when we see what's happening nationally, mm-hmm. Certainly folks on the left are very concerned. I think even folks on the right are concerned with what they see happening in Minnesota and other places. Mm-hmm. But the reality is in Dallas, we have not had that type of ICE activity, the raids on places and things like that. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's just been it's played out differently in Dallas. I think that we primarily, I think we overall have a positive view of law enforcement from our local police mm-hmm. through our federal partners, and that includes ICE. Yeah. And so it's just a different feel mm-hmm. down there. Like I said, I've lived in both places,
right.
And I feel like the mistrust of law enforcement. Yeah. Certainly, we have activists. Certainly, we have people who have issues with mm-hmm. what's happening, even in places outside of Dallas that want to have protests and things like that in Dallas. But I don't feel like that is where the mood of the overall electorate is, even though I would describe it as a left-leaning electorate.
So our series is the Institute of Global Politics Across the Aisle. You are born and raised Dallas.
That's right.
African American, 3 different Ivy League universities.
Couldn't figure out the Columbia piece, though. Couldn't figure that one.
Well, yeah, I mean, everybody.
Not everybody's not able.
Everybody can't do it. You switched parties.
I did.
Why?
This is a question that even after I've answered it, so many times, it doesn't get any easier to explain it, or because it is so complicated for me, yet in some ways simple. So the simplest way to put it is, I think there was always a mismatch between my fundamental nature, which is a conservative-minded person, mm-hmm. and my political affiliation. I feel like in a lot of ways, I inherited my political affiliation by virtue of being I'm just going to be frank with the folks in this room. Being African American, it's in some ways easier to tell folks that you're giving up Jesus than to tell them you're giving up the Democrat Party. We have a very, very deep and long-standing relationship with Democrat Party as African Americans. And that is something that when I decided I wanted to get involved in politics, it wasn't even a negotiable in my mind. It's like, you're going to be operating as a Democrat. It's just what kind, how are you going to? And so I started my political career in the only party I thought that you could. But it was always a bit uncomfortable for me because, and I will say this, and then I could go on for a long time. Probably ought to write a book or something that no one will read about this topic for me.
That happens.
To get this off my chest. But I feel like there is a prevailing narrative that in some way fuels the left, that the country doesn't work for people who look like us, and that it's fundamentally broken, and it fundamentally does not offer opportunity to people who look like us, and that I can't say, when I'm honest about my life experience, that is how it played out for me. I had a tremendous amount of opportunity given to me at every point, really. And I found that institutions all along the way, individuals, companies, educational institutions, you name it, if I was willing to put myself out there, do the work, I can hardly think of a situation where I was denied whatever I wanted, denied opportunity. And so I feel like in some ways the Democrat Party needs the narrative that the system is fundamentally broken to justify and explain the need for so much government intervention in people's lives and in the economy. And the reality is, I think that we have overstated that, and that the country really actually functions quite well for most people if they're willing to put in the work. And so that tension was always there. There was always a tension between the role that faith played in my family and my life and how it played out and how it was allowed to play out in the Democratic Party. I'm a lot more openly religious person and a lot more faith-driven than I think was ever comfortable in the Democratic Party. I also think, and this was the issue that ended up being the issue that, as mayor, the policy issue that ended up being kind of the straw that broke the camel's back for me in the moment. I am definitely, and it's particular at this point in my life where my primary orientation and my thinking is as a father, right? I think mostly about my children. The role that public safety plays and the relationship between, I think, the Democrat Party and its, in some ways, and you were actually a very good mayor on this, but I think a lot of Democrats, public safety is a challenging issue for Democrats, I will just say that. And I think it has a lot to do with...
I think it's how you engage in public safety or community safety. All the Democrats I know don't like crime.
Yeah, that's what we all say.
Yeah.
But that's not where, in terms of policy, which is what I'm getting at,
Okay.
where when the rubber meets the road,
Right.
the defund the police situation, that came from the left. And that would never have come from the right. And it got traction on the left, and it got traction in my city, and it put me in the crosshairs politically because that is where the Democratic Party thought they needed to be on that issue.
Well,
Turns out that's not where folks in our communities thought we needed to be. But
not all Democrats.
Well, we can roll a bunch of clips of the folks who were in leadership roles.
Right, I understand.
In our party leading our cities and in elected roles, where they were 100% across the board for the most part on this defund, if not dismantle, position. And I stood out like a sore thumb when I said absolutely not.
You don't
for our
think that
city.
was
By the way, this
frustration of what people were experiencing? I mean, you know, a lot of folks in the African-American community are not against the police. They're against police
that's
brutality.
exactly what I said.
When I call 911, I do not expect you to come and beat my ass.
By the way, that's exactly what I said, which is why I said this is about Democrat, Republican, not black and non-black, because I knew, in fact, when I stood up against the defund the police effort, that the black community was going to be in agreement with me. That essentially this was an effort that was being led by liberal-minded folks who don't live with the consequence of these policy decisions. The proposals to cut our police budget by 60%,
right.
to not do the things that we needed to do to keep our community safe, was, I think, pure politics at the expense of the community that, frankly, that produced me, that I care a lot about. But it was a glaring example of where I didn't agree with that.
Well, but not to go.
And I had a lot of animus aimed at me. This is why I'm still a Democrat.
Right.
But I'm taking this position
I understand.
against defund, and I've got the protesters at my house. I've got the threats on the internet. I've got the heightened alerts. We've got the need for additional presence at my house, security presence, because my children are being threatened. It was not pretty.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of changes a person too.
No, I hear you. And that is never acceptable
So
under any set of circumstances.
So my orientation politically, I'm much more comfortable
Yeah.
as a Republican. I'm much more comfortable in the party that embraces conservative values. I am the one that embraces liberal values. Sure. Although that is not the same as saying that I think that the current iteration of the party or the current powers that be within the party, I don't agree with everything that's being done, but I am going to be in the camp of the folks who are on the side of law and order and who believe more in the opportunity that the country provides and believes that the country fundamentally works well and wants to encourage folks to do the best they can and work as hard as they can than the other.
I hear. We're going to jump into Q&A in a second, but tell us 1, 2, 3 lightning round. What's exciting about being mayor?
Wow, lightning round. What's exciting about being mayor? It's an interesting time to be mayor because I think.
Because your post, you governed through the pandemic.
I did.
And
I'm one of the few that's left who was mayor when the pandemic started and is still around. It really drove a lot of really impressive people out of office. I mean, it made a lot of people say, it was a lot.
It was time.
It was a lot. Here's what I think is really interesting about being mayor right now. You have challenges whether your city is like mine, which is one of the ones that's growing really fast and the recipient of a lot of people and corporate relocations, because the challenge is in those situations how you deal with the growth and how you deal with the impact, again, on affordability. I wish we had more time to dig into this, and I wish I could articulate this a little better, a little faster. But in some ways, affordability is the product of your success. The lack of affordability is what I'm really getting at. What drives up the cost of your housing stock, what drives up the cost of living in a city is the demand for living in that city. The better you do, the more successful you are, the more expensive it gets to be there.
Right.
There's
only so many places.
This country is huge, and there are actually a ton of places to be. There are a ton of places to be that are quote unquote affordable to be. They just were not where you are choosing to live.
Right.
Malibu, California is expensive for a reason. It costs a different amount to live in Malibu, California than it costs to live in
Montana.
Well, Montana's expensive too in some places, but I mean,
Never been to Montana.
But no, it's beautiful. It's actually not affordable there either. But my point is that is being determined though by how good a job people are doing in creating places that people want to live. So in a weird way, the better you do at your job as mayor, the more challenges you're going to get from the influx of people, like the influx of Californians in particular, but we also get a lot from Chicago too. That's our second biggest source of folks.
Interesting.
That's a challenge. But then the other challenge is if you're one of the cities that's losing, if it's population that you're bleeding or companies that you're bleeding, now the pressure's on you to figure out how to stop it.
Tax base is
because your tax base is shrinking, and now your tax burden on the folks who are remaining is higher, and so it becomes this this sort of death spiral.
Yeah.
And so it's challenging either way. It's challenging if you're growing. It's challenging if you're shrinking. And so I happen to be in the situation.
Still the best job, though.
It is. It's a great job if you love people, because everyone. I didn't understand until I had children, young children. My children are still very young, 11, 8, and 4. Every children's TV show has a mayor character in it if they have any political character at all, and they almost all do for some reason. I'd never noticed that until I had children. I had to watch all this children's programming. They don't have a governor figure. They don't have a president figure. They don't have a senator figure. They have a mayor figure. Everyone gets the concept of, usually the mayor has a sash and a hat and or scepter, something like that. But the point is it's a role that from the youngest age. I didn't bring my scepter or my sash.
Okay.
It's a role that from the youngest age we are taught is an important one, and that everybody knows that we have this person, and so it's a lot of responsibility.
Sure.
But it's a great job, because as you'll remember, while you have the mantle of leadership as mayor, in addition to the policy responsibilities, and that differs depending on the way your system is set up, you had more direct operational control than I do in Dallas.
Yeah.
But one thing that does not change about being mayor, no matter where you are, is that you are viewed as the human embodiment of the spirit of your city. When people are looking at Mayor Nutter, when you're the mayor of Philadelphia, they're looking at Philadelphia.
Right.
You're speaking for Philadelphia.
Absolutely.
Everywhere you go,
Yep.
Not just in your city, but out everywhere.
Yeah.
That's Philadelphia right there. So how you talk, how you carry yourself, the swagger that you walk, you really, and you feel that. You definitely feel that when you walk into a room as the mayor of Philadelphia, when you're traveling around the country, that you're representing that city and its whole history.
It's a great feeling.
It is a great feeling. It's a lot of responsibility too, because you don't want to embarrass your people.
Well, that's true. As my grandmother said, every time I walked out of the house, you representing the family.
You're representing the family.
Right. Don't be making fools of yourself.
Right.
We're going to do some questions.
Yeah, let's do questions.
Brown jacket. Is that a jacket or a shacket?
Firstly, go Birds.
My man.
Oh man, you slipped it in there.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
She's gonna hold it.
My name's Denzel Ivory. I'll just be quick. You just mentioned a sense of more or less direct operational control depending on where you govern.
Yeah.
So with the U.S. being under a federalist system, how do we build a sense of city government empowerment in a system in which at its core limits city government power and places higher agency and arguably more value in state and federal governments?
I somewhat disagree with that actual description of the way our governments are arranged. So I do agree. Federalism is more about the relationship between the federal government and the 50 states. Municipal government, uniquely actually in most places, is the state is sovereign. It has the ability to issue charters, essentially, to municipalities, and we call them home rule charters in Texas, and they call them different things different places.
Right.
But that charter essentially is a constitution that gives you very wide latitude to govern. It's the analog to federalism vis-a-vis the state and the city. Any place where you haven't been preempted by the state government, you have the unfettered ability to legislate, which is actually quite a bit. I mean, it's actually quite a bit. And so municipal government actually has quite a bit of influence and quite a bit of impact on your daily life. And it has a similar sort of relationship between it and the state government as the state government has with the federal government. But I don't view it as being squeezed out or anything by the concept of federalism. Where our issue comes in is increasingly you see where there's a growing partisan political divide between who's in charge at the local level, who the mayor or the city council is, and who's in charge of the legislature. Depending on how that relationship is, what the respective parties are of the folks, they will try to curb the power of local government because they don't like the policies that are rightfully the cities to enact, but they don't like the direction of the policy. So I'll just tell you, in a state like Texas, the direction is it's a red state with a red legislature, and they don't want to see the cities doing things that they consider to be too progressive. And I think it's not as common to see it the other way around.
Yeah.
But when you have blue legislatures and red municipalities, you have the dynamic in reverse. But essentially, that is, I think, a more accurate description of the division of power in our country. But mayors, the real question is whether or not you are in a strong mayor form of government or not. When you're in a strong mayor form of government, you had no shortage of power and ability to do things to benefit your people.
Well, I had to sometimes remind people of that, but
I'm constrained a bit by the council manager form of government, what I can do, because
city manager and that form. So,
that's the bigger division.
Amen. John.
Thank you. Really interesting talk. I'm interested when you're talking about the sort of business attraction that you're experiencing now, and there's been a lot of writing by Richard Florida and some other urbanists on this mobility of residents to move between cities. How do you retain them when they've been attracted by like a lack of kind of government taxes or government intervention? Like, how do you retain these new companies, and how do you think sort of longer term about ensuring this isn't like a boom bust cycle of movement?
I love that question. I've never had anyone actually ask that before, how we sort of, how we're going to try to make sure it's lasting. Because, again, I think anyone can come up with, and we do, come up with these incentive packages to try to get a company to open a second, an HQ2, second headquarters, or expand their operations. But how do you get them to stay beyond the length of the deal? Because these deals usually you have to create a certain number of jobs within a certain amount of time. That to me is the heavier lifting and the more interesting work that city government has to engage in. And for anyone who's interested in city government, this is where you make your living, because what you have to try to do is to create a city that in all of the ways that are sustainable and lasting and important, your city can compete with over the long term. So, for example, in Dallas, one of the things I leaned in very heavily with when I got in office was our park system. I said, people really care about having, and the pandemic really brought this to fore, they care about having beautiful spaces, public spaces, green spaces, and trails and things to get outdoors and to commune with nature, but for children to have a place to go and play and that are safe. So we have grown by leaps and bounds, and our amount of parkland and our park system is now the #1 rated park system in Texas for a major city, and one of the higher rated major city park systems in the United States, which wasn't the case before. That's something that will inure benefits for a long time. Investing in public safety, again, we should have a whole nother conversation sometime about why that's such an important issue, but perceptions of safety, reality of safety, but even just the perception of it is so important to your long-term sustainability as a city, and whether or not people want to invest in your city for the long haul. So leaning in on public safety, leaning in on things like your park system, and I think your infrastructure investments, making sure people feel like they'll have access to reliable sources of water, which once you get west of the Mississippi actually becomes an issue. That type of thing is what you have to do to keep the companies for the long haul. And that's actually the day-to-day interesting work of city government, is how to make sure you have a safe city and a clean city and a good, green, vibrant city.
I've got over here. We're going to wrap up, and then I have a last thing for you.
Okay, sure.
Thank you for sharing. I'm curious, how do you maintain this relative political stability and policy predictability in a country that's increasingly polarized? Because thank you for your ICE question. I just realized that keeping the 9th largest city off the headlines is kind of hard right now.
It's very hard. We elect our mayors on a nonpartisan basis in Texas. And so when people say I switched parties, what they mean is I made it known that my affiliation was no longer as a Democrat. But it wasn't. But I can't run as a Democrat or as a Republican. You just run. It's just your name on the ballot. There's no D's or R's. And so that actually helps keep the temperature down a little bit, running on a nonpartisan basis. It's also the case. This is in my personal example. No one has been able to successfully point to any change in my policy positions from before or after I switched parties. In other words, I'm being very consistent with what I'm doing. The difference is what I was doing on the public safety side of things was getting me a lot of protests and heat when I was a Democrat, and it got me support when I switched. But it's the same. It's the same position. We've been on a hiring tear in our police department since I became the mayor because it's important to me. We're spending more, on hiring and hiring at a faster pace than we have in a very long time. And I'm proud to tell you, our police staffing now is the highest it's been right now in the last 12 years. We're at the highest we've been in 12 years. And our crime has fallen. Not everyone's crime is falling now. The media loves to talk about how everyone's crime is falling.
Yours was going down before.
But ours was going down, and you know this because we talked about it a lot when I was working on it. We're in 5 consecutive year-over-year reductions in our violent crime. So not just picking the pre-pandemic point and saying, relative to that, but outdoing the last year's reduction. 5 consecutive years in that, in every violent crime category. And so that is a product, I think, of my commitment to that issue. But that that commitment to that issue was not tied to, it's not like when I became a Republican, I started going crazy on police spending and trying to prove a point. I think that is how we've been able to kind of keep the temperature down.
Mayor,
consistency.
These incredible young people, some are first years, some are second years. We've got other folks who are here. But at the end of the day, of course, this is also about their futures, their careers, their lives. Give some. You were in school not too long ago. Some closing thoughts on going into public service and just kind of general career advice.
Well, first of all, it's an honor to even be able to speak to you guys, and I wouldn't presume to know all that much, but I do feel like I recall being in your shoes and being in graduate school, and I look back on that time, and I think when I think about my classmates and what most of them are doing, most of my classmates and most of the people I think who go through these programs generally really lean in on the bureaucracy and on serving within the bureaucracy and serving in one of the appointed roles, or not in the elected side of things. I can't think of actually anyone from my class who actually not only is not serving in office, but has ever run for it.
Excuse me.
I really do believe that where we are as a country right now, and we probably have been here for a long time, but I think we're feeling it now. We could really stand to have more trained, public policy trained individuals on the elected side of the House. I think we've really, and Secretary Lew, when we were talking beforehand, we were talking about some of the issues about Congress and why Congress works the way it does.
Dysfunctional?
And why it's so dysfunctional. And on some deep level, I think, it's a bigger problem than I think people realize. There's been such a debasement of the of the role of public official, elected official. And so it's such amateur hour in so many ways, and there's such a gap between people's understanding of policy and their ability to get on television and talk about things that the people who are running the show on the elected side are just not all that competent. They just aren't. And our system, I think, used to...
And much like the two of us, have also not generally had the responsibility of actually being in charge of things.
That's right. That's right.
That you have to deliver.
That's right. I mean,
every day.
And that's a whole conversation that mayors love to talk about, because it is a big difference between legislating and I remember being in a legislature versus being in the mayor's role and the expectations on results. But that's a slightly different point that I'm even wanting to make. What I'm saying is, I think that we have to... It just worries me that foreign policy, that tax policy, these very important and weighty things. There's no insignificant law, but or body of law. But in those areas, like for example, foreign policy and tax policy, I just don't think we have the brain power that we need on the elected side of the House in some of those roles, some of those key roles, helping form these policies. And we need more folks who've been trained in maximizing the public good and how you actually analyze policy on the elected side. I think we've run out of time on being able to get by with what we have. Right? We have folks right now who I think are they're almost playing politics. They're play acting, it seems like. It's unbelievable.
So get ready to run for office.
We need it.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, Dallas Mayor Eric Johnson.
Hey, thank you.